There's a moment that happens to certain people, usually after they've lost absolutely everything, where they stop trying to get their old life back. And instead, quietly, without telling anyone, they start becoming someone completely different. Not a better version of who they were, not a repaired version, a different person entirely, different values, different habits, different way of speaking, walking, thinking, loving. Sometimes even a different name, a different city, a different face in the mirror that they don't fully recognize yet, but somehow already trust more than the one that came before it. You've probably seen this happen to someone. Maybe a family member who disappeared for a year after a divorce and came back unrecognizable. Maybe a friend who lost their business and resurfaced 2 years later running something completely different, speaking with a confidence that wasn't there before. Maybe you felt this pull yourself, the strange, quiet realization that after losing everything, some part of you doesn't actually want the old life back. It wants something new, something that was never possible while the old life was still standing. Today we're going deep into the psychology of people who don't just recover after losing everything, they reinvent. We're going to look at exactly how this happens, stage by stage, what separates a true reinvention from a person just pretending to be okay, and why some people emerge from devastation as someone almost unrecognizable, while others spend years trying and failing to feel like themselves again, and stay until the end. Because there's a specific psychological trap that catches most people halfway through reinvention. A point where they think they've become someone new, but they've actually just built a slightly disguised version of the same person who fell apart in the first place. I'll show you exactly how to know the difference, because it's the one thing that determines whether your reinvention actually holds or quietly collapses the moment life gets hard again. Let's start with something important. Losing everything and reinventing yourself are not the same thing. Most people assume they are. They assume that if you lose your job, your relationship, your money, your reputation, reinvention just happens automatically as a byproduct of the loss. But it doesn't. Loss is common. Almost everyone experiences devastating loss at some point in their life. Reinvention, real reinvention, is rare. Most people who lose everything simply rebuild the exact same life, with the exact same patterns, just with different names and faces filling the same roles. Same type of relationship, same type of job, same coping mechanisms, same unconscious beliefs about who they're allowed to be. So the real question isn't, why does losing everything change people? We covered that territory before. The real question, the one that actually matters, is this. Why do some people use total loss as raw material for building someone entirely new, while most people use it to rebuild a copy of what they lost? The answer starts with understanding what psychologists call the self-concept, the internal story you carry about who you are. Most people believe their self-concept is something fixed, something true, something discovered rather than built. But it isn't. Your self-concept is actually closer to a habit than a fact. It's a pattern of thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors that got reinforced so many times, for so many years, that it started to feel like an unchangeable truth about you, rather than what it actually is, a story you've been telling yourself, repeated so often it calcified into identity. Here's why this matters so much. As long as your life circumstances remain relatively stable, same job, same relationships, same routines, your self-concept has no reason to change. It gets reinforced daily, simply by living your normal life. You believe you're not a risk taker because you've never had to take a real risk. You believe you're not creative because you've never been in a position where creativity was demanded of you. You believe 100 quiet little things about yourself that were never actually true. They were just never tested. Losing everything is the single most powerful test your self-concept will ever face. And here's the critical part. When the test happens, one of two things occurs. Either your old self-concept survives the test, gets patched up, and you go back to being essentially the same person, just a little more bruised. Or your old self-concept doesn't survive the test at all. it shatters completely. And in the wreckage, you're forced to build a completely new story about who you are, because the old story simply doesn't apply to the person you now have to become in order to survive. This is the fork in the road. And what determines which path someone takes isn't the severity of the loss. Some people lose almost everything and barely change. Other people lose something relatively smaller and transform entirely. The deciding factor is something much more specific: how tightly someone's identity was fused to the thing they lost. Let's slow down on this, because this is one of the most important ideas in this entire video. If your sense of self was mostly built around being a successful business owner, and the business collapses, your identity collapses with it, because there was no separation between the role and the self. But if your sense of self was built around something deeper, something like, I am someone who solves problems, who adapts, who figures things out, then losing the business is devastating, painful, humiliating even. But it doesn't destroy your identity, because your identity was never actually the business in the first place. It was the underlying capability that built the business, which can now go on to build something else entirely. This is why some people, after bankruptcy, spiral into a depression they never fully recover from, while other people, after the exact same bankruptcy, seem to bounce back within a year, often building something even bigger than before. The difference isn't talent. It isn't luck. It's whether their identity was fused to the outcome or fused to the underlying capacity that created the outcome. And here's the uncomfortable truth hiding inside this. Most people don't know which category they're in until they lose everything. You don't find out whether your identity is fused to your job title, your relationship status, your bank account, or your reputation until that thing is suddenly gone, and you discover in that terrifying moment whether there's a you left standing underneath it, or whether the you was actually just the thing itself, wearing a name. This is why total loss is so psychologically violent. It's not just painful, it's revealing. It shows you, often for the first time in your life, exactly how much of your identity was borrowed from circumstances, and how much of it was actually truly yours. Now let's talk about what actually happens, step by step, inside someone who goes on to genuinely reinvent themselves. Because this isn't a vague, mystical process. It follows a recognizable pattern, and understanding this pattern is going to change the way you think about your own capacity to change. The first stage is what we can call the death of the performance. Before reinvention can begin, something has to die, and what dies first isn't hope, and it isn't even the old life. What dies first is the performance. Every person, to some degree, performs a version of themselves for the people around them. The competent one, the strong one, the one who has it together, the one who always knows what to do. This performance takes enormous energy to maintain, but most people don't notice the energy cost because they've been maintaining it for so long it feels automatic. When someone loses everything, the performance becomes impossible to sustain. You can't perform successful business owner once the business is gone. You can't perform happily married once the marriage has publicly ended. The mask that took years to build gets ripped away in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. And underneath the mask, there's often a strange, disorienting relief mixed in with the devastation. A relief that almost nobody talks about because it feels shameful to admit. Relief that you don't have to pretend anymore. Relief that the exhausting performance is finally, mercifully, over. This is the first crack that makes reinvention possible, because you cannot build something authentic on top of a performance that's still running. The performance has to collapse first. And for most people, it takes total loss to force that collapse, because as long as the performance is even partially working, they'll keep maintaining it out of habit, out of fear, out of simple inertia. The second stage is what we can call the identity vacuum. This is the stage almost everyone underestimates, and it's usually the most painful part of the entire process, more painful in many cases than the original loss itself. Once the performance collapses and the old identity is gone, there's a period where there's simply Nothing there yet. No new identity has formed. The old one is gone and the new one hasn't been built. This is a genuinely terrifying psychological state, because human beings are deeply uncomfortable existing without a clear sense of who they are. We need an answer to the question, who am I? And when that answer temporarily disappears, the mind panics. This is the stage where people make their most important decisions, not because the vacuum feels good, but because of how they respond to it. Some people, unable to tolerate the emptiness, rush to fill it with the fastest available identity, often a copy of the one they just lost, or an identity handed to them by someone else, a family member, a new partner, a new job that happens to be available, regardless of whether it actually fits who they're becoming. This is how people end up rebuilding the same broken pattern in a new outfit. But other people, and this is the group we're really interested in, learn to tolerate the vacuum. They let themselves exist, uncomfortably, without a clear answer to who am I, for weeks, sometimes months, sometimes longer. And it's specifically inside this uncomfortable, undefined space that real reinvention becomes possible. Because for the first time in years, maybe ever, there's no old identity pulling them back into familiar patterns. There's just open space, and the terrifying, exhilarating freedom to decide what goes into it. The third stage is experimentation, and this is where reinvention actually starts to take physical shape in someone's life. This stage looks messy from the outside, and it often looks messy from the inside too. It's the stage where someone tries on different versions of a new self, almost like trying on clothes, seeing what fits and what doesn't. Maybe they move to a new city where nobody knows their old story. Maybe they take a job completely unrelated to their old career, just to see what it feels like to be someone new. Maybe they start speaking differently, dressing differently, spending time with completely different types of people. This experimentation phase is critical, and it's also where a lot of judgment gets aimed at people going through reinvention. Friends and family, still holding onto the old version of that person, often interpret this experimentation as instability, as a crisis, as someone losing it. But what's actually happening is closer to construction than collapse. The person is testing different pieces of a new identity, keeping what resonates, discarding what doesn't, slowly assembling a version of themselves that actually fits who they're becoming, rather than who they used to be. This is also why reinvention almost always benefits from some degree of anonymity. A new city, a new social circle, a fresh start where nobody has expectations of who you're supposed to be. This isn't running away, even though it often gets labeled that way. It's removing the social pressure that would otherwise pull someone back into their old patterns before the new identity has had a chance to solidify. It's almost impossible to become someone new while surrounded entirely by people who only recognize and only reward who you used to be. The fourth stage is what we can call identity consolidation, the point where the new self stops feeling like an experiment and starts feeling like simply who you are. This doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen through a single dramatic decision. It happens through repetition. Every small choice that aligns with the new identity, the new habit, the new boundary, the new way of responding to stress, the new type of person you choose to spend time with becomes a vote for the new self. And eventually, after enough votes, something shifts. The new way of being stops requiring conscious effort. It becomes automatic. It becomes simply you. This is the stage where people who knew the old you start to say things like, "You've changed so much," or "I barely recognize you." And what's interesting is that this comment, which sounds like an observation about behavior, is actually a much deeper observation. They're not just seeing new habits. They're sensing an entirely different internal operating system running the show. Now, here's where I need to give you the warning I promised at the beginning of this video, because this next part is exactly where most people's reinvention quietly fails, without them ever realizing it failed. There's a trap that catches people almost exactly in the middle of this process, usually somewhere between the experimentation stage and the consolidation stage. And the trap is this: mistaking a change in circumstances for a change in identity. Here's what this looks like. Someone loses everything. They move to a new city. They get a new job. They start dressing differently, talking differently, presenting a new version of themselves to the world. From the outside, it looks exactly like reinvention. And for a while, it even feels like reinvention from the inside. New environment, new energy, new sense of possibility. But underneath the new surface, the same old wounds, the same old fears, the same old unconscious beliefs are often still fully intact, completely unaddressed, just wearing a new outfit. The person who was terrified of abandonment before the collapse is often still terrified of abandonment after the reinvention. They've just built a new personality on top of the fear, instead of actually healing it. The person whose entire self-worth was built on external achievement before losing everything often rebuilds an entirely new identity that's still, underneath it all, built on external achievement. Just a different type of achievement, in a different field, with a different audience. This is why some people go through what looks like a dramatic, inspiring reinvention, only to collapse again a few years later, in an almost identical way to before. Different city, different career, different relationship, but the same underlying pattern, the same unhealed wound, quietly running the entire show from underneath the new performance. Real reinvention was never actually happening. What was happening was a very convincing costume change. So how do you know the difference? How do you know if you're actually reinventing yourself, or just performing a new version of the same unresolved pattern? Here's the test, and it's a test almost nobody applies to themselves, because it requires a kind of honesty that's genuinely uncomfortable. Ask yourself, has anything about my internal experience actually changed, or has only the external presentation changed? Do I still feel the same underlying fear, just directed at new circumstances? Do I still find myself needing the same type of validation, just from a new audience? Do I still avoid the same type of vulnerability, just wearing a more confident-looking mask? Real reinvention isn't primarily about what you're doing differently on the outside. It's about what's actually different in how you relate to fear, to failure, to rejection, to uncertainty, underneath all of that outside activity. You can change your career, your city, your relationship status, your entire visible life, and still be operating from the exact same wounded, unconscious place you were operating from before everything collapsed. And you can, in rare cases, change almost nothing about your external circumstances and still undergo a profound, real reinvention, simply because something fundamental has shifted in how you relate to yourself internally. This is the part almost nobody tells you about reinvention, and it's the single most important thing in this entire video. Real reinvention isn't primarily an external event. It's an internal one. The external changes, the new city, the new job, the new relationship, the new appearance. These are often the visible symptoms of reinvention, but they're not the reinvention itself. The actual reinvention happens in a much quieter place. In the moment someone stops needing external achievement to feel worthy. In the moment, someone stops abandoning their own needs to keep other people comfortable. In the moment, someone finally becomes able to tolerate being alone without panicking, or capable of receiving love without needing to earn it first. These internal shifts don't always announce themselves with a dramatic new job or a new city. Sometimes the most profound reinventions happen almost invisibly, inside someone who looks from the outside, almost exactly the same as they did before everything fell apart, except that everything about how they carry themselves through the world has quietly, fundamentally changed. Now let's talk about something that might be the most useful, practical piece of this entire conversation. How to actually move through this process yourself, if you're someone standing in the wreckage right now, wondering if you're capable of becoming someone new. The first thing to understand is that you cannot think your way into a new identity. This surprises people, because our culture is obsessed with the idea that mindset comes first, That if you just believe hard enough in the new version of yourself, the behavior will follow. But the psychology of identity actually works the other way around, more often than not. Identity follows behavior far more reliably than behavior follows identity. You don't think your way into becoming a disciplined person and then start acting disciplined. You act in small disciplined ways, repeatedly, and the identity of a disciplined person gradually forms as a result of the evidence you're generating for yourself. This means the path forward isn't waiting until you feel like a completely reinvented version of yourself before you start acting like one. It's the opposite. It's choosing small, specific actions that align with who you're deciding to become, taking those actions before you feel ready, before you feel confident, before it feels natural, and trusting that the identity will eventually catch up to the behavior, rather than the other way around. The second thing to understand is that reinvention requires you to tolerate being a beginner again, often at an age or a life stage where being a beginner feels humiliating. This is one of the quiet reasons so many people abandon reinvention halfway through. The old identity, whatever its flaws, came with a certain competence. You knew how to do it. You knew how to be that person. The new identity, by definition, comes without that competence. You're clumsy at it. You're uncertain. You second-guess yourself constantly. And this discomfort, the discomfort of being bad at being yourself, is often what sends people running back to the old identity, even when the old identity was the very thing that collapsed. If you're in the middle of reinvention right now, and everything feels clumsy, uncertain, like you're fumbling your way through a version of yourself you haven't fully grown into yet, understand that this isn't evidence that reinvention isn't working. It's evidence that it is. Competence in a new identity doesn't arrive before the discomfort. It arrives after you've tolerated enough of the discomfort for long enough that the new way of being finally starts to feel less like a performance and more like simply who you are. The third thing, and this might be the most important, is understanding that reinvention isn't a straight line. It doesn't move steadily forward, day after day, toward a clean, finished version of a new self. It moves in loops. You'll have days, sometimes weeks, where the new identity feels solid, confident, real. And then something will happen, a setback, a rejection, an old trigger, and you'll feel yourself sliding backward into old patterns, old fears, old ways of coping that you thought you'd already left behind. This isn't failure. This is simply what the process of change actually looks like, underneath the inspiring highlight reel version of reinvention that gets told in hindsight, once the whole story is complete and the messy middle has been edited out. The people who actually complete their reinvention aren't the ones who never slide backward. They're the ones who, when they notice themselves sliding backward, gently redirect themselves back toward the new pattern, over and over, without using the slip as proof that the whole thing is hopeless. Reinvention isn't about becoming someone who never struggles again. It's about becoming someone who, even while struggling, keeps choosing the new pattern more often than the old one, until eventually, the new pattern simply becomes the default. Let's talk about one more thing before we close, because it's something almost nobody mentions when they talk about reinvention, and it might be the most important piece of all, the loneliness of it. Reinvention is often deeply lonely, and this loneliness catches most people off guard, because they expect the process to feel empowering the entire way through. Sometimes it does, but often, especially in the middle of it, it feels like standing in a space between two worlds. You no longer fully belong to your old life, the old friends, the old identity, the old version of yourself that everyone around you still remembers and sometimes still expects. But you don't fully belong to the new life yet either, because it isn't finished, it isn't solid, it isn't fully real yet, even to you. This in-between space is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through it. But if you're standing in it right now, understand this. Every single person who has ever completed a genuine reinvention passed through this exact same lonely, undefined space. Nobody skips it. There's no version of becoming someone new that bypasses the discomfort of temporarily belonging fully to neither the old life nor the new one. This isn't a sign that something has gone wrong with your reinvention. It's one of the clearest signs that it's actually happening. So if you've lost everything, the job, the relationship, the money, the identity you spent years building, and some quiet part of you doesn't actually want the old version of your life back, doesn't want to rebuild exactly what was lost, wants something different, something you can't fully articulate yet, something that scares you and excites you in equal measure, trust that instinct. It isn't running away. It isn't instability. It's the beginning of a process that almost every person who has ever truly reinvented themselves had to walk through, usually while everyone around them assumed they were falling apart, when really, quietly, invisibly, they were finally becoming who they were always capable of being. The old version of you isn't waiting to come back. It's gone. And what's actually waiting on the other side of this uncomfortable, lonely, uncertain space isn't a repaired version of who you used to be. It's someone you haven't fully met yet, someone built not from what you lost, but from what was left standing underneath it, once everything false had finally been stripped away. If this video helped you understand your own reinvention, or gave you the language for something you've been quietly going through without knowing how to explain it, make sure you're subscribed to Psychologic Mindset, because every week we go deep into the psychology behind the moments that shape who we really become, the patterns underneath transformation that almost nobody properly explains. Let me know in the comments, have you ever reinvented yourself after losing everything? What did you become on the other side of it? I read every comment, and I would genuinely like to know your story. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this one. It was a long one, I know. But if you made it this far, some part of you is already in the middle of becoming someone new. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.